Hello, welcome to the Nonprofit Coach, our bi-monthly webinar series. Today we're going to be focusing on the new report, Everyday Donors of Color, Insights from the Lilly School of Philanthropy. I'm really excited to dive into some of the insights that are here and to share the great parts that have come out of that, the things that we're happy to learn, and also the limitations of this report and where it can point us into the future. So thank you very much for being here today. I am Elizabeth Finlayson. I am the CEO and lead coach of the Nonprofit Coach. And as a team, our mission is to create a fairer and more equitable world filled with empathy and beauty. And we do this by providing strategic planning, fundraising training, and support. So welcome. Thank you for being here today. I want to provide a little context as to how this fits in. So we provide these other services here. We provide coaching where people can use just even an hour or so per month of fundraising best practices to move their fundraising up to the next level without a huge investment. And that sometimes could be a really great way to get started, particularly if you don't have a fundraising staff member yet, or maybe you have somebody who is younger or newer. It's a really good way to get grounded in best practices and move things forward as you're getting ready for a larger fundraising investment in the future. We have an online grant writing course. We provide board trainings and retreats. We also, as part of our bi-monthly webinar series, we record these. They are on YouTube, and we have executive director quarterly sessions, and we have board quarterly sessions to allow people the opportunity to, those are not recorded, and people can just turn off and just talk about problems that they're facing. We also do strategic planning and consulting on a variety of fundraising areas. So with that, the bi-monthly webinar series, just to be really clear, these are free. They were created out of the pandemic when I realized that we were going into what would be my third recession that I had fundraised through. And I knew that a lot of our great nonprofits would not actually make it through if they didn't have good practices. And so we started to provide as much information as quickly as possible to organizations so that they could get through that really challenging time. And after a while, we realized that it was really working, that people were finding us, and that we had a great time connecting with organizations around the country and even sometimes around the world. In this, we usually do a general topic overview, or we do a deep dive into a specific slice of a broader topic. We have guest speakers, but these are not meant to replace any paid consulting or training that you have from me or anybody else. I just want to be clear that these are just kind of broader than what you would find in those experiences. So with that, let's get started. Again, we're going to talk about the everyday donors of color philanthropy during times of change. And this is coming through the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. There's also some other collaboration with the University of Chicago to create this. And lots of organizations and people participated to provide the information that we're able to look at today. So I think that's really exciting. It is a place to show where we can go as a sector as we help to move philanthropy forward. So just before we got into like what motivates donors of color in the United States to give, is that we just want to put a little bit of context. So doing that, we want to understand that the U.S. population, I think we all know, is more racially and ethnically diverse than it is ever before. So that creates some significant demographic shifts. And there are implications, obviously, for philanthropy in the nonprofit sector in there. And hopefully that's not the only reason we are interested in this topic. Oh, we have lots of people jumping in here. This report represents an expansion into the academic research into donors of color. But we can say that over time, there hasn't been a lot of research on this yet. So this is really, we can look at this as a beginning. There's a lot of things that remain unknown, even from this report itself. So in the report, while they were able to highlight some broader trends and break them into the groups that they focused on for this, we can also know that they didn't look into more deeply yet how marriage or age or other things like that affected the way this data came out or what kinds of trends that they saw. And the other thing I would like you to know is, while we're going to talk really, really broadly about donors of color and what might motivate donors of color, what people might be interested in, we have to understand that it all comes down to individuals. Individuals are making their own choices, and that even this umbrella term, donors of color, is really, really broad, right? Because they have talked to Hispanic donors, Asian donors. They spoke to Native American donors, and to religious leaders, and they spoke to I think I missed it, and to Black organizations and Black donors. So all of those have come together, and so they looked at them in pieces and they looked at them broadly together. So just as a understanding that these are generalizations. So let's talk about what the research shows that might be distinct from particularly like white donors, and how they were able to break those apart and look at this. So let's look at like motivating donors of color in the United States. So one of those things is faith. So faith has been a deep motivator, and you can see if you compare that against non-Hispanic white donors, it is a stronger motivation to give than you see with that group of donors. And so the philanthropy is often linked closely with donors' religious beliefs and deep roots in religious traditions. Self-help is an important part as well. So philanthropy is sometimes seen as an economic weapon to fight against racial oppression of one's own racial or ethnic group, that there's a way to combat narratives that are there, or to deal with problems that people see. And that's another large motivation that you can see for donors of color. And this goes into this idea of reciprocity. So because donors often feel excluded from mainstream culture, minority groups form their own communities to share economic reciprocity with each other. And so you would see that as part of this. And we can talk about how in 2020, that the report focuses on, there are really specific things that came out of that are specific to that moment, but there's also these longer trends that you can see from way before 2020 and what's there. So sometimes there's maybe even an exaggeration of the trends and motivations that happened in 2020. They were already there, but we were, I think, in a country, a culture, and a world that was under pressure. Also, you can see donors of color wanting to level the playing field. Donors feel that they want to provide better pathways to success for younger generations, and especially in terms of education. You see this most for Asian and Black donors of color, but with different motivations that are there. But either way, you can see that these are things that are really important. So let's also look at where donors of color have been directing their giving to this point. We talked about, obviously, the religious component of that. So houses of worship and religious group are really significant. They are the heart of giving for many diverse donors. And they may also be a place where people are directing their giving. So the giving may be directly to that religious organization. It may also be the beginning of connecting on to other organizations and causes, like perhaps a connection to mutual aid societies, or a connection to, say, food pantries or things like that. So you can see that this can be central to the way particularly donors of color are directing their giving. We just talked about before with the leveling the playing field and the motivations that there is an interest in education. So universities and other education-related organizations follow into that. And I spoke that especially for Black and Asian groups, there is a prioritization to education as a means for creating a path for future generations to succeed. And then this makes sense when we're talking about that previous motivation of self-help and wanting to direct our philanthropy to our own ethnic and racial groups, that the civil rights and arts organizations come into this. So one thing you can also be looking at is if your organization has already been listed, you may be thinking about, well, how can I connect my organization to what donors of color are interested in? And so you can think about, like, many donors of color, they prefer to giving to organizations whose mission is to counteract racism directed at their own ethnic group. You may be thinking about, if you're an arts organization, for instance, how are you connecting into that? And have you looked clearly enough at your own organization's history and how it intersects with that? So these are the things we can start to ask ourselves as organizations as we're kind of going through these different motivations and where donors of color are directing their giving. And ethnic financial institutions. So financial institutions, such as banks, provide access to capital like bank loans for diverse populations. This is actually especially popular to Hispanic donors when they start to break out this larger umbrella term of donors of color to the different groups. You can see that Hispanic donors are very interested in economic mobility for the Hispanic community. And there's also a thought of how do we move ourselves out of everything that's happened from COVID-19. And so this is one of the things that is especially interesting. Now, so we've talked about motivations and we've talked about where donors are directing their giving. But for me, I actually think one of the more interesting parts of this conversation is how donors of color are giving, because I think this is really important. And I think it's a time to take a step back and look at the way the philanthropic industry has looked at giving historically. So we have been calculating for decades how much people gave financially, what mechanisms, like for instance, we know that during the Great Depression, planned giving went up compared to other types of giving. So all of those things have been tracked for a really long time. But in that, there was a blind spot in that less formal mechanisms of giving were not being tracked or were not really considered part of philanthropy. And if we look at some of these underlying motivations for donors of color, one of the things that comes up is a lack of trust, and I would say an earned lack of trust, right? There's really good reasons why certain ethnic and racial communities would feel a lack of trust towards either the government, to other broader institutions. But with that, there has been a desire for people to concentrate their giving in different ways. So you can start to see that people are using maybe less traditional mechanisms to give. So we're going to talk about some of those, and I'm going to talk about the ones that are not even maybe on this list. So looking at giving through small groups and personal connections, there are a few ways that this happens. This could be something, again, like through a faith institution, but it can also happen really commonly through families, through neighbors, through strangers. For instance, Black donors are much more likely to say that they have given recently to a stranger, or Hispanic people, there's often a tendency to give an expectation to give within families, even say children supporting parents. So there's all this type of informal giving that is happening in communities of color that has not often been recognized or captured by the data. And so I think this is really important because when you aggregate the data and look at it and you weight out education and age and socioeconomic levels, what you find is that giving is fairly consistent across all racial and ethnic groups. There aren't any significant differences. But what we can see is that for donors of color, that there are these other ways that people are giving. And so part of it is people are giving within their communities. They're giving directly to people in a way that you don't see as often in white non-Hispanic communities. They can be strangers, they can be family members. People might be getting together in groups And so all of these are ways in which giving is happening that has not been recognized or captured in the past. Giving through giving circles. So this is another way. So these provide direct, local, and immediate ways for members of an ethnic community to fund as other members of their racial community in need of assistance. And you can also think about mutual aid societies and time banking as part of these things. So one of the principles of community-centric fundraising that's moving away from the donor-centric fundraising is to begin to recognize time as equally valuable to money. And that's not often how we have looked at philanthropy, but it's really interesting in the way that you can think that the hour we are spending together, we will never get back. Whereas, perhaps if I were to donate $100 and I can go and I can earn another $100, I will have $100 again. But the time that we have is literally the most precious resource we have, and yet it is often been under-recognized and underutilized. So giving circles can be sometimes a way that people will recognize contributions that go beyond economic contributions to other people. I found this really fascinating, but what the research has found through this report is that giving through online platforms is really significant. So you can see a significant amount of social media giving and a much higher use of crowdfunding platforms than you see in white non-Hispanic donors. And part of that you can see looking at 2020 is people felt a need to mobilize very, very quickly. And so there were these informal ways as well as formal ways. So people started things like mutual aid societies in the pandemic in order to respond to needs that were there. But people also created shared Google Sheets or just began to post things in social media and over Twitter or Facebook or things like that. So people were using all these ways that they could to connect as quickly as possible to get need in the hands of people. And when we think about also the idea of mistrust of more traditional or the perception of whiter institutions, you can also see that sometimes there is a desire not to pay for the overhead of nonprofits is sometimes what people are avoiding. And part of it is just to move very, very quickly. But the idea that if people are giving to these online platforms, as a fundraising consultant, I often am happy if we're engaging over social media, but I have typically said, this is great as an engagement strategy. We want it to be part of our fundraising, but I don't put a strong emphasis on it because I know that giving comes more readily through other channels like email, mail, phone, in person. And so I try to move donors from those social media channels onto these more structured channels, or I would like to say warmer channels where you can have more interaction with people. But if we know that we're trying to get in front of a group of donors and they are all on Twitter, or they are all sharing a Google Sheet, or they are on some other platform, or they're on crowdfunding, I think it's important to look at that and say, all right, if this is a group I'm trying to be in front of and I know that this is a good fit for my organization, then I need to move some of my solicitation efforts onto that platform. Okay, so this is something we want to look at is who gives to racial and social justice organizations. And so we have a chat, so I'm actually going to just stop and see if there's a question in here. So the question is, do you think the sense of urgency for all populations is directly correlated to online giving for the speed? I could see check writing and donor advice funds resulting from causes that may not have the same sense of urgency. Oh, that is a really good question. I would say that when we've seen check writing and, funds coming from checks coming from donor advice funds, we're seeing one, obviously, part of it is generational. The people who feel most comfortable writing a check are older. Even people who are, getting direct mail or they're getting a letter that gives them the idea to give, and that we know that that is more effective, that more giving comes that way. We also know that that person may then just go online and make the gift that way. So the trigger might have been through the mail, but then the behavior then might be an online gift. So that's part of what you'll see, some of those distinctions. And I think then the other part when you'll see is the check writing and the donor advice funds. It's really just access to donors of wealth. And this is something I think is really tricky when we talk about donors of color, because one of the things that we want everybody to really be aware of is that there are definitely donors of color who are major donors. And in the report, they talk about donors to, for instance, the Smithsonian, who are giving million and multi-million dollar gifts. So we want to be really clear that there are large donors of color. And when we're looking at median income for, say, the Black U.S. population and the white non-Hispanic population, it's a difference of over $100,000. So, and that's, I think, also sometimes driving donors of color, in particular when we're talking about these things like self-help and reciprocity. We say, how do we get our communities to be as strong as those communities over there? Since we can see that there's clearly a difference, and we can see that there isn't the investment that we know should be there that allows us all to grow. So let me know if I answered your question, and you can chat again if you've got more about that. So really good question here. So I thought this was really interesting. In the report, there's actually several places where I think Asian donors kind of break from the rest of the group. There's this, I think, with the greater awareness of violence against Asian and AAPI people that happened through the pandemic, you can see there's an increase in our Asian donor populations banding together, working towards social and racial justice, and looking at, are there ways to create increased political power as well? And you could think about even each of these terms, right, are very, very broad. Like if you're looking at AAPI, those are lots and lots of countries of origin for people who are in those groups coming together and saying, we have something shared that we can create a shared identity together. And you could say the same thing with like the Black U.S. population. People could be coming originally with their ancestors from several different places. And so we're creating these blanket terms that allow us to come together as groups and to create shared power. But I think it's also important for us to look and say, these are also distinct people with distinct histories. And so each of these groups have distinct histories, and within that, there are distinct histories and distinct backgrounds. And I think that is, as a sector, we need to be aware of that and making sure that we are thinking carefully about it. And so with that, you can see that Asian donors were particularly interested in donating to social and racial causes, and that continues with Black donors being the next, and Hispanic donors, and then white non-Hispanic donors. We have another chat question, so I'm going to close. Oh, thank you. So we have this is good information. Thank you. I think so too. So I want to talk a little bit more here about some of the other pieces that are here. So when we talk about formal and informal ways of giving, one of the things that we want to keep in mind, for instance, is volunteerism is incredibly high, particularly in the Black community. Things like giving blood is something that hasn't typically been looked at as part of philanthropy, and yet, like, literally, you're giving a part of your body so that other people can live and be healthy. These are really interesting. Donating goods is another one that's really high, and for each of these areas is actually higher than white non-Hispanic groups. And so it's important, again, to be looking at this wider tapestry of giving and what's there. So from a nonprofit perspective, we might think to ourselves, in what way can I be offering more opportunities for people to be giving at our organization? And I think another thing that is, if we're looking from a community-centric standpoint, another question is, how do we partner together as nonprofits? My favorite term is this idea of the nonprofit Hunger Games, how we're being set up sometimes against each other to compete from resources that are often coming from maybe politically tricky places where people may have gotten wealth in ways that we don't agree with or can be harmful to our communities or to our environment. And then we're courting those donors in a donor-centric model. Those major donors then get to dictate the way our organizations work at the worst end of the donor-centric model. And so if we're looking at a community-centric model, if we're not looking at competing against each other, because really we are all here together to make the world better, it's a place then we can look and say, well, if, one of the things I looked at the beginning of the pandemic for arts organizations that were shut down for a while, well, you've got a band of actors, perhaps. What can those actors be doing? Can they be donating blood? Can they be going and picking up groceries and bringing those to people's houses? Can they be working with a food pantry? And can you be recording that and collecting that and putting it out on social media so people could see we're not dead, we're not gone, we're not doing what we were doing before because we're in this particular moment. And I think these are the things that we need to ask ourselves of, like, is our mission just organizational survival, or is our mission to actually perform a greater good? So these are really important when we're thinking about engaging donors of color. There's an organization that I respect highly, Virginia Community Voice, and one of the things that they have done is they created a monthly giving program in which, one, they are asking their donors to donate 3 hours a month to amplify the voices of people of color, particularly the neighbors in the area that they're working in. And also, people can be part of their monthly giving program if they are only giving time and they are not giving dollars, and really starting to value those more similarly. So I think when we have these ideas, they can't just stay as ideas. They have to turn into actual action. The other thing is we're looking at mutual aid across racial and ethnic groups. If you look at, say, particularly Black people, 86% say that they give to people that they know, that there's a desire to help people that they know outside of just money. Sometimes people are driving an elderly neighbor to the doctor. Those are all ways that people are contributing to stronger communities, helping strangers outside of money, and then giving money actually to strangers. And you can see those are much higher than for white non-Hispanic donors. We talked a bit about trust and confidence and how this is important. So I actually want to use the example of a friend of mine who she grew up on the south side of Chicago, and she then moved later to the west side of Chicago. And even though she's African American and she had a great desire to be helping her community, she knew that their trust was not there. She was still an outsider, even though it's still Chicago. It's just a different neighborhood of Chicago. Even though she matched racially with the group of people she was with, she still was an outsider. And the way that she approached that was to just keep showing up and to keep showing up at meetings. As she said, literally it took about 7 years. And I think that's something we don't think about from the philanthropic sector. Philanthropy has a history, whether it's people from Europe or people from the United States parachuting, say, onto the continent of Africa and coming out, be like, thank you, here, I've done this project for you, or whether it's white-led organizations coming into Black communities and getting back out again. Those tiny short partnerships or those short activities can sometimes be more detrimental because the trust isn't there, and that trust needs to be built up over time. And that time might be a longer time than what might feel comfortable or what you might be used to. And so I think for those of us who are in leadership positions in organizations, it's really important to be thinking about, how do I build trust with other organizations, in communities that I'm not currently working in, or maybe in communities you are working in. In 2020, there were white-led organizations that got in trouble, even though they thought they were doing everything in a way that worked. Maybe they were serving, let's say again, like a primarily Black community, and they felt like they were providing everything should. I knew of at least one organization that had a problem where people in the community felt that they had not been responsive to their needs. They didn't feel that there was enough leadership with people of color. And these are the types of things that we need to be proactive, and we need to be thinking about these things ahead of time and not waiting for other people to call us out. So that's something I would just say about trust and confidence that's there from the beginning. I'm going to stop and check on the chat again. So yeah, listening to communities is a great start, but often ignored. I think that, yeah, that could be true. And, you know, as you say, it's a great start. If we listen and we don't have action or we don't have change, we can actually feed into a narrative of mistrust. And so making sure that that listening is followed by action. And it might be hard action. It might take time. There is a comment here. I think this is a question. Historically, do minorities have a regular tendency to give to other minorities? So I may be addressing this, but one of the things that came out in the report was that there is a growing sense of solidarity in which, for instance, the Asian community felt like Asian donors were doing a good job at beginning to identify, say, Black-led organizations that they wanted to work with and say, we actually are in this together and we have shared goals and we want to increase the overall conversation about you know, inclusion and diversity, and not just center it just on, say, people of Asian identity. And so I think there is a growing sense of this is more than one group. And the other thing, obviously, we know there's greater attention to these issues in the white community, not white non-Hispanic community as well. But there was also some information that suggested that more white donors came and flocked to those causes, and then now even less than before, say, the George Floyd killings are present and interested. And I think more has to be dug into those that information to see, is there a fatigue that's there? Is there, sometimes I hear people expressing a narrative that they're afraid that they're being made wrong, and or that there's criticism of them from their white identity. And so I think that we need to keep looking into this. But there's also, I think, a real excitement and an energy and a desire for everyone to come together and make change. So it's not only one way that this is happening, but I think it's one of the things we can take out of the moment that we're in. So the question, so are you saying since there's been crimes on Asians more, now they're willing to give across the line? By across the line, I think you're saying beyond beyond Asians. Yes. The research was suggesting that Asian donors felt excited that they were focused on AAPI causes and creating organizations that responded to their needs, but also beyond the Asian community. So yes. The other thing that we do really, really want to recognize is that, you know, for instance, Asian donors in the Asian community in this report were saying violence against Asian is not recent. This has happened for as long as Asian people have been coming to the United States. And they wanted it to be clear that this is part of a longer pattern. And each of these groups has a history that is distinct. And so the philanthropy is also distinct. So I haven't spoken a lot about Native Americans, but for instance, mutual aid societies. I'm wondering actually, are people familiar with what those are? Does anybody want to actually even put forward a definition? you can unmute. I won't hurt you. Okay, so a mutual aid society can actually be quite informal, but it can be formal as well. Usually as these begin to develop, they become more formal because it becomes clear that even with no paid staff, that expenses are part of it. For instance, websites and transportation, and how do you track people's time or their money? And so things like this become formal over time, but they're usually a group of members. They can be small, like 20 people, or they can be thousands of people. They can be local to an area, which I think is what we saw a lot of over the last, year and a half, let's say. But they also can span continents. But people who are members are giving into it, but they're also sharing in the benefit. So you're getting more of the sense, as we talked about, that reciprocity. If you look at time banks, which I think is such a fascinating concept, all time is considered equal. And so somebody who is an accountant and they're spending an hour helping someone with their taxes, that is equivalent to then somebody else in that time bank who provides an hour of babysitting. And then that person gets a credit, and then maybe they're able to spend that in an hour of web design so that they can build their business. And so people are actually helping each other. It's a really good way to recognize and account for important work that isn't always paid work or isn't seen, or the people that you're trying to help maybe don't have the resources to pay for it. It originally came, there was a book that said like no more throwaway people. And it gave an opportunity also for people who would be on the receiving end to be giving. That everybody has skills, everybody has things to offer. And so this is one of the ways where a community might say, hey, we're in this moment, as we were with the pandemic, or we're in this community, and if we want it to grow, we're going to have to help each other. It's not really coming from outside of here. So let's just look at these like main themes here that, one, I hope it's really clear that there are these diverse modes of giving. That was, I think, actually one of the most important things I got out of this report. And looking at those different ways of giving, we can then say, how do we engage people in outside of the ways we've always gone about asking and soliciting for gifts or other types of support? Oh, and I don't think I talked about as much, but goods or in kind is part of all of that as well. There is, and I think this is really clear, prioritizing racial and ethnic minorities in racial justice, grant making, and giving. That I think is hopefully quite clear that this is becoming important both inside and outside communities of color. Yes, I was starting to talk about the distinct histories and the resources and challenges. So if you look at, say, like Native American communities, that they have had these, what we now call like mutual aid societies, for a very, very long time. It's a way that they've traditionally helped each other. And so that is something that was just baked into what they were already doing. And so for each group, those things are true, that there are ways that people helped each other. One of the things that I have not touched upon, and I really do want to make clear when we're talking about this type of work, a very interesting thing that came to my attention is that donors of color, because they are more visible members of their communities for nonprofits and philanthropic organizations, they will often act as intermediaries between those more formal institutions and philanthropic means of giving and nonprofits and the communities of color that they might represent. And so what happens is they end up doing, what we kind of talk about in racial justice work, like the unpaid labor of acting as a communicator and the representative and helping the nonprofits and the philanthropic organizations to understand the racial equity work and understand the community. And so one thing I really want to emphasize as nonprofits, it's really important for all of us to continue doing our own work. I know I have come a long way on this journey, and I know that I am not done if any of us are ever done. And it's really important that we are finding the resources like these reports, like this webinar, so go ahead and pat yourself on the back, that we're reading the books, that we're attending the webinars, that we're doing what it needs to do, journaling, etc., to move ourselves forward in these racial equity conversations and not just rely on our donors of color, because there is a concern that the donors of color who are acting in these informal roles as intermediaries will get burned out from constantly having to play these dual roles and this communicator and bridge between these different communities. It's also why it becomes more important as we're looking at our board makeup and our staff and leadership makeup that we're having as many people of color as possible from these different groups. And so that we're looking at our own processes, whether it's our staffing processes, whether it's the number of hoops and obstacles that we make people and organizations jump through to access the benefits of our organizations. So all of that becomes really critically important. So then we're better able to respond to the communities of color that are coming to us without such a difference that's there. Because this is something where if we're burning out our donors of color, we're going to have a really big problem. All right, I'm going to again check the chat. Maybe a little more than journaling. Yeah, that's probably true. I think that is true. But I do think there's also a really interesting set of exercises and work that people are doing now where they're looking at the internal work and looking at the body work that is all part of this beyond just say reading or getting something intellectually, but looking at when they're responding on a physical level, and how do people unlearn some of the, we'll say like racialized habits of responding to other groups or people of difference. So if we look at the strengths of this current environment, there is a lot of opportunity. So I hope that we're coming out of this hopeful, that we're able to see that just having these conversations, that these conversations are little invisible bridges from one group to another, from one organization to another, and they allow us to find new futures. Oh, that's really great. Some of the challenges that are there is we can't, I think, just rest and say, you know, we had this George Floyd moment and now it's all going to work out. I think there's real work that needs to be done. Having been in this sector for 20 years, it's really clear to me that people with the best of intentions, and sometimes I have been one of these people who think that they are moving things forward in racial equity, can sometimes at the same time, let's say, as moving things forward, also making mistakes that can be damaging to people or communities of color. And if we're recognizing that and we're recognizing we're all growing, then we can just take a step back, apologize if we've made a mistake, and learn. But I think I've seen organizations do things that were fairly harmful and unwilling to take responsibility for those and unwilling to make changes. So if you're at an organization and you either are seeing a problem or you're hearing from people that there's a problem, even if you don't think there's a problem, I really ask that you start a formal structure in your organization that allows the organization to look at its policies and procedures and to make real changes. And they might be uncomfortable changes. I think one of the things I've had to grapple with is my frustration over organizations being ineffective and wanting to increase policies and procedures to create more structure and measurement. And also a conversation about how sometimes we're creating so many obstacles for people to participate in our organizations or to be recipients of grants that we are creating racial barriers when we don't intend to. And I think there's a tension there, but it's a tension that I would like us to be dancing with rather than avoiding. All right, so I've got some more chat here. I'm going to read this out. So can you share, as I've just experienced this, when white organizations fundraise, they're asking, but when Black organizations ask, they're begging. How do we get beyond that when a lot of times a minority organization does a lot more boots on the ground in the trenches work because the families trust their own more. What do you suggest we do to overcome that stigma? Wow, that's really, really interesting. No, I'm not sure. I haven't heard anyone describe organizations in that way. I have heard people in the sector, fundraisers, in this case, white fundraisers at primarily white organizations, describing their own work as begging. So I do think there is an undercurrent of feeling, I think people feel frustrated in having to ask for resources. Now, one thing I have always been delighted about fundraising, even when I can find it frustrating, is that fundraising is a mechanism that puts us accountable to people outside of our organization. Because we need dollars, because we need resources, we have to continue to prove ourselves over and over again. We have to continue to sharpen our message and to communicate and to get in front of more and newer people. It also sometimes has put us too accountable to people who have traditional wealth. And so that's where I think we see these power discrepancies happening. I don't know that I have a good answer other than what you're suggesting. I think we need to call attention to it when there's a feeling that that is happening. And I think that for those of us who are aligned with communities of wealth, I really ask that we look critically at ways that we can support communities that don't have as much traditional wealth, because I think we can even this up, but we're going to have to be a bridge. I remember once doing a fundraising workshop for an organization that was fighting gang-related violence in their community. They were doing lots of boots on the ground work. And I remember as I was speaking best fundraising practices to them, I could just see that I didn't know how they could get from where they were at to the communities that had the wealth, because the network wasn't there to support that growth. And so I think if we ourselves have access to those networks, I'm asking that we bring them to these other organizations that are doing the boots on the ground work, because it is really critically important. All right, I've been doing a lot of talking at you, and I've had a lot of coffee, so I talk really fast. You guys have been doing great questions on the chat, but I want to stop and allow people to ask questions. And I'll say you can ask them on the chat. I find that when we're talking about whenever we do one of our anti-racism webinars, I find that people are a little bit shyer about speaking out. And I think it's because people are afraid to be wrong or make a mistake. So if people have more questions, I really ask that you put them in the chat now. Okay, so what I'd like to do then is to share some of what I see as the opportunities and next steps that organizations can take when approaching donors of color. The one is to approach with respect. Obviously, I think that's a given, but I think a real question is, what does that mean? And I would say starting with this place of understanding that communities of color do have major gift donors. That's one of the things I think we just need to understand. And we need to understand that there are these long traditions of giving and ways that people are giving both formally and informally. And I think that informs the respect that we use to approach donors of color. So like I said, understanding that there are these long philanthropic histories, doing our own equity work. We talked about, don't rely on the small numbers of BIPOC staff and donors to do that work for you. Really try to dig in and have the hard conversations with yourself. Allow yourself to get triggered or angry or whatever it takes to get to that other place. It's just the willingness to be uncomfortable is a journey itself. And it will, I think, help you in many areas of your life, not just here. Really look at how your organization values both time and money and see if you're creating an inequity in the way that is done. Bringing people of color into decision-making roles, it doesn't make sense to have organizations that have white non-Hispanic people on the board and in the leadership and all through the organization, and then decide you're suddenly just going to come to donors of color. I think you need to look at how are you really transforming from the inside out, and as a place to start. It's really important, I think, that we understand that communities of color have well-deserved lack of trust in traditional organizations, and that it can take a long time to build trust, and to just be patient about that. It doesn't mean anything is wrong, or people don't like you or your organization, or they don't see your value. Maybe they don't see your value. They don't need to yet. So be patient, take a breath, and understand that trust takes time. As we've seen, we need to be looking at the ways that we're asking for dollars that goes beyond the ways that we've traditionally used. It might be doing more crowdfunding. It might be reaching out to people to be people of influence on our behalf on social media who reach a different audience. It might be participating in blood drives with another organization. All of those can be ways that we're really looking to reach out to different communities and use different modes. Support organizations of color led by people of color. I would really say, put your money where your mouth is, put your time where your mouth is. And then understand that formality and systems, even though I love formality and systems, I just have to say it, they can be a barrier to participation. And sometimes they can actually be considered racist themselves. So really look at those things just as places to look for areas of growth and ways that we can continue to become more racially equitable places. Okay, well, if you are interested in contacting our team, we are the Nonprofit Coach. You can reach us at services at thenonprofitcoach.guru or on our website, thenonprofitcoach.guru. Oh, we've got another chat here. Ooh, let's see, gotta go up to find it. It says that formality and systems may be part of the perceived difference between asking and begging. Oh, yeah, that is a really excellent point. When we look at things like micro-giving, it's really interesting. I heard there was a woman who was leading a workshop that talked about how she was giving out micro-grants to Black female entrepreneurs. And they were, I think, grants of something like $100. And the criticism that she received was both that the amounts were too much, but also that they weren't tracked well enough to see if people used them well. And she's like, well, which one is it? Is it that it's not enough to make a difference, or that it's just so much money, someone just might blow it on something ridiculous? And I thought that was an interesting point. And again, it was uncomfortable for me to say, like, how would it feel to just give out $100 to an entrepreneur? Or they were talking about a organization, a mutual aid society that started during the pandemic that was giving grants of like $500 or $1,000 to Black-led organizations every month. And it was also voted on by the community. So how are we being more democratically led? How are we bringing in more voices? So yeah, I think looking at where we have formality and informality can be one of those divisions. So really excellent point. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for your time today. I am going to turn off recording and stay on for just a few more minutes if anyone wants to ask any questions. So thank you.